Today is Thursday, July 4th, AD 2024. This is the Africa Review in 5, written by Mark Christopher and presented by Amikani Katunga. Kenya's eco-tax revolt, a Christian response. Over the course of recent weeks, a violent anti-tax protest erupted in Kenya, beginning in the capital of Nairobi before spreading to other municipalities. At the time this article was written, protesters stormed the Parliament building and set it ablaze. All of the Kenyan parliamentarians safely escaped through an evacuation tunnel. It's been reported that the police have opened fire with live rounds. So far, 39 people have been reported killed, while dozens were injured. It's also been reported that some 50 people are missing and are thought to have been abducted by Kenyan police. The President of Kenya, William Ruto, has sought to ease tensions and bring some measure of calm to the uprising. So, what exactly prompted such a protest? As reported before on TARIF, it all stems from a bill that was passed recently by Kenya's lawmakers which impose a hefty countrywide tax increase on many of the necessities and staples Kenyans need and buy. Everything from nappies to electronic goods will see a significant price increase. Part of the new tax plan includes a substantial eco-levy on basic goods to curb waste management. While most media outlets are reporting the protests in Kenya, they've left out one important fact. These protests are directly related to draconian environmental policies foisted on Kenya because of a large loan the Kenyan government took from the International Monetary Fund. The enforcement of these policies required various taxes. The main report consulted for this article well notes that this is part of a familiar and historic pattern in Africa. The so-called international community and powerful global Western institutions like the IMF regularly induce governments to take on huge debts and then begin to impose from abroad drastic societal reform measures on the population. From a biblical worldview perspective, what can be learned from this recent and ongoing saga in Kenya? 1. It's a sober reminder that the borrower is truly servant to the lender. Proverbs 22 verse 7 reminds us that the rich rules over the poor, and the borrower becomes the lender's slave. This is as true for the individual as it is for a nation. One wonders when African leaders will learn that money offered from international sources usually comes with numerous strings attached. In the case of Kenya's protests, the IMF is trying to impose stifling economic environmental policies and taxes, which will hurt Kenya's further development to lift many out of poverty. 2. From a Christian perspective, there's a better way to respond to a bad policy than violently protesting and rioting. As believers, we have a witness and a testimony to uphold. There are more peaceful ways to protest by using all legal channels and lobbying politicians. Christians should never resort to violence to make a point. In a democratic society, we have legal channels, peaceful protests, and the ballot box at our disposal to voice our disapproval. 3. Where the environment is concerned, Christians have a God-ordained stewardship to care for God's wonderful creation. There are two important facets of this entrusted stewardship from God to man, as outlined in Genesis 1, verses 26 through 28, and Psalm 8, verses 3 through 8. Though God holds the title deed to the earth and all that's in it, man is to be the custodian and manager of all God has made. In keeping with this, God has granted humanity the authority to care for His creation. This has two prongs to it. Firstly, integral to stewardship is the aspect of wisely using the resources God has given us for the provision of humanity. Sadly, greed and selfish ambition often lead to the exploitation of these resources without regard for tomorrow or others. But this should not be the reason for radical policies that go to the other extreme of barring God's image-bearing custodians from responsibly accessing what is needed for the preservation of life and lifting people out of poverty. Secondly, Stewardship also includes the component of counting the financial cost of implementing environmental policies, as Jesus said in one of his parables in Luke 14 verses 28 through 32. No one goes off to war without first responsibly counting the cost. The reality is that many environmental policies cost much but deliver little benefit in return. Good stewardship certainly requires a balanced and realistic approach that cares for the environment while simultaneously promoting the common good for all humanity. This is by no means an easy balancing act, but it should be the goal of Christians and politicians alike. 4. Another principle to consider when approaching the environment is that people are not a pathogen. In the Genesis account of God's creation of Adam and Eve, it's clear that image bearers of God are unique and the pinnacle of God's creative handiwork. Therefore, non-human creation is not to be elevated above God's image bearers. Yet, many of the environmental policies promoted today are agenda-driven policies that invert God's divine order in creation by placing humans under the dominion of creation rather than seeking humans as dominion keepers over non-human creation. Today, in the thinking of most environmentalists, there is an implied misanthropic, that's to say man-hating, attitude. So a rock is a tree, is a pig, is a boy. Consequently, it's no surprise that most environmentalists are pro-abortion as well as population control advocates. The only way to lift millions of Africans out of poverty is through an abundance of cheap energy. This requires the use of fossil fuels, which entities like the IMF want to tax out of reach for most. 5. In the final analysis, it must be remembered we are fallen creatures who live on a sin-cursed earth. This complicates our duty as responsible dominion keepers more than we know. In the end, God will preserve and sustain His wonderful creation. Humanity may adversely impact the environment, but God promises in Genesis 8 verse 22, "While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease." This is by no means an excuse for indifference toward creation on our part, but rather a promise that humans will never completely destroy what God has entrusted them. In conclusion, while there is little we can do to help physically in Kenya, we can pray for a more constructive and peaceful approach in protesting these new eco-taxes. We can also learn the lessons from the perils of borrowing money from those with ulterior motives. We can also adopt a more balanced approach as stewards of all God's creation while informing others of the same. In this, our caring for creation must include calculating the price tag. Above all, don't forget that the earth is the Lord's and all it contains, the world and those who dwell in it. And that's it for the Africa Review in 5 on this Thursday, July 4th, in the year of our Lord 2024. Comment with your thoughts on the ongoing issue in Kenya and a Christian response to it all. And don't forget to subscribe to the Missionary Minds podcast on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. I'm Memikani Katunga. Be not weary in well-doing.